Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's finally time to paint. This is the final part of my process for this character Plushmellow. In this part I'll be showing you how I did the materials. To begin with, I create a new image texture and add it to the material for the character. Make sure you save that image frequently because it's not technically part of the Blender file itself, meaning it won't autosave when you crash or something like that. Now I pick my colors off the reference and start filling in the objects that just have a flat color. For some next parts, I use the paint mask that works by making a mask from your edit mode selection. That way I can select the parts I want to color, for example the claws on the hands or the mane, and then just fill them in again with a flat color without filling in the rest of the mesh. I use that same process for the tail. For the body, the color regions don't really match up with the topology, so I just outline them and then fill them in just using the default brush. In order to speed up my process a little bit, I actually made a color palette. That way I can just add all the colors that I pick from the ref and don't have to repick them every time I start working on a piece. You can also use Control to switch between your two colors in your little color bar. Right now I have the dark purple and the white. That way if I accidentally go over the edge or something with my purple, I can quickly erase it with the white without having to go into my palette and select the color again. Another thing that's really useful while texture painting that I kind of forgot about until really late on in the process is that you can hold S and hover over a region to select the color and automatically add it to your color palette. The nice thing is that it also ignores viewport shading, so you don't have to set it to flat colors in order to pick an accurate color. Anyway, now with the base colors done, I quickly start adding in the main symbol or pattern thingy he has on his chest, as well as the first pieces of designs he has around his shoulders. I don't quite finish them up at this point, I'll get back to them later on. Now onto the face. Like the body, it has two main regions of color, so again I outline the darker purple parts and fill them in with just the basic simple brush again. I also add in the flat colors on the top of the ears. Next I go around the mesh, around the face and the hands, and clean up the parts of the mesh where the paint mask left some weird rough edges. I also do the same for the tip of the tail, adding a bit of fluff detail so it's not just a weird transition. Next I head back to the body and start adding in the stripes in the two different colors. I again outline around about where I think the edge of the stripe should be, and then fill them in with a lighter purple color. I also add in the dark purple again for the transition between the white belly and the darker purple back. It's kind of hard to see where exactly the stripes are on the reference, but I do my best and just kind of translate it into 3D as best as possible. However, given the design of the reference, I don't think the stripes are in one super specific order and arrangement like they are on some other characters, so it's not too bad if they aren't quite exactly the same. With the stripes done, I add in the patches of lighter fur around the edge of the tail. Again outlining the edge and then filling them in with a lighter pinkish purple. From there I move back to the thighs. I fill in a couple of extra stripes to fill in the space and match what I can kind of see on the reference. And then I fill in the light pinkish purple again for the fluffy parts at the sides of the legs. Then back to the stripes, I add some tweaks around the shoulders and then add on the stripes to the thighs. And then I fix up the lighter fluff because I kind of didn't do the back and the edges were a bit rough and messy still. Next, it's time to head back to the face for a while. I add in a darker shade of purple he has around the eyes, and then paint on the eyebrows. I originally had the eyebrows as an extra piece of geometry, but I think it worked just fine just painted on. I also head back to the shoulders and paint on those last few stripes that I'm still missing. Back to the head, the ears also have a bit of a darker shade of purple, so I add that in too. Now it's time for the inside of the mouth. Since I can't see it with the mouth closed, I just paint in the basic flat color on the flat image texture. But from there I still need to smooth out the edge, so I make a shape key to open the mouth. In my first attempt, I forgot to turn off auto merge and I got into a bit of an issue with parts of the lips sticking together, so I had to head back to a previous save. Luckily, since the image texture is saved separately, I didn't lose any of my painting progress. Attempt number 2 worked out fine, and while the mouth shape doesn't look particularly good, that doesn't really matter since it's really just there so that I can blend out the edge of the lips. Now for the teeth. I paint in the gums with the same yellowish color that I've been using for the horns and everything else, since the inside of the mouth is yellow-orange, or like goldish, I guess. And I do the same for the lower teeth. With that, all the flat colors are done for this model, so it's time to start adding in some more details. I start with a tail and add in a big gradient. I run into a couple of issues because of how the projection painting works in Blender. It kind of cuts off the backside weirdly and ends up with like weird sharp edges that I have to manually smooth out. But it ended up looking fine, so it doesn't really matter. The new Sculpt Vertex paint tools don't have these issues, and I'm kind of hoping that gets implemented to texture painting too. But until then, I might look into some other pieces of software or add-ons or something that would work a bit better. I do the same thing on the hair and run into the same issues, though I redo them again later because I decide that they have the wrong flat color. The hair on the reference pretty much has the exact same color as the mane, and in this case I made it a shade darker, which isn't really that great. Speaking of the color of the mane, I paint around all the main pieces on the UV map with the same purple color that the mane is made up of. That way I don't get any weird white bits seeping through around the edge of my seams or something like that. Anyway, here you can see me try to fix the hair and match it to the mane. I first try by just adding in the main color as the gradient, but I really don't like how it's working out and how it's looking, especially since I don't have any good way to add the dark color to the mane as well, so I just end up filling it in completely with the flat mane color and re-adding the gradients. This time I add in the gradients with a light pinkish color, which I picked off the reference again using S. Once I'm happy with how that looks, I move on and do the same thing around the mane itself. As you can see, I get quite a couple of weird glitchy parts because of how the projection works and how it paints on parts that I don't want to paint on or blocks out parts that I do want to paint on. But with some tweaking around and using the blur and smudge brushes to clean stuff up, it eventually turns out in a way that looks pretty good. Now I go around making some tweaks to various parts of the model, adding some stripes, moving up the dark purple around the base of the legs, tweaking the tail a little bit, and just all that fun stuff. Now for the eyes. On the reference he has only very faint irises, so I create the paint mask again and just carefully make a really light gradient around the top. And now it's time to start messing around with fun material shenanigans. I add an ambient occlusion node because I want to bake in some ambient occlusion later on, and I adjust it messing around with different color settings and all that to try and decide how exactly I want it to look. Next I work on the horns and the claws. For the horns I just add a new material and make it gold, but for the claws, since they have two colors, I need to kind of mask out the parts that I want gold. For that I make a color ramp and use it to very specifically mask out the color that I painted the nails, and then make that gold too. I originally had that as the same material as the body, but that wasn't really working out well, so I made it a separate material. Back to the paint, it's time for the final tweaks and stuff like that. I add in secondary colors to the little fluffy parts around the legs, and go in with my brush. Now it's set to pressure sensitivity for both size and transparency, and I go around adding little fur details around all the edges of my stripes everywhere where two colors transition into each other. That just kind of makes the whole thing feel a bit more organic and interesting and not as flat. Back up at the face, I add in a little bit of color around his eyes, and then I add in the dark scar or mark thing he has going across his eye. Now with the flat colors pretty much done, I go back to the materials and continue tweaking them a bit. I mess around with the ambient occlusion in cycles now, adjusting the color and the color ramp and everything until I'm happy with the effect and how it all looks. From there I add in a new image texture, which I'm going to eventually bake the ambient occlusion and the flat color to. But before that, I add in the final few stripy details to the tail and the back, which I had missed out when I was working on them earlier. As I said, for this part I have pressure sensitivity on for both the size and the strength. That way with my tablet I can get some nice, quick, wispy, furry details. I also have the symmetry turned off for this part, that way it breaks up the model a bit and makes the whole thing feel a bit more organic. Now I go around adding a little bit more detail and variation to stuff like the hair and the tail, just to make sure everything is nice and cleaned up and the way I want it before I add in the baking, because after baking it's kind of hard to add in more color and detail. Now back to the shading. For the body, everything is set up for baking. I have my ambient occlusion plugged in to a mix RGB node set to multiply to mix it with the base color, and I have the whole thing going out through a viewer node, so it's set to emit. One last thing I still do before it's time to bake is go into the eyes and add in a new mask, a new texture to mask out metalness so that the irises are kind of metallic. I end up removing that in the end since it made the irises and stuff way too visible and way more so than they were on the reference, but it was still fun to mess around with, so I kept it in. Anyway, it's finally time to bake now. Sadly, it's not super visible in the footage what I do, but essentially I make sure that the final texture I want, the mixture of the flat color and ambient occlusion, is out through the emission shader. Then I select the texture I made for ambient occlusion, and then go down into the render tab with cycles selected, and select emit and bake. And with that, I have created a new texture that has both ambient occlusion and the flat color. Now I just go around and clean up parts that kind of ended up with issues. For example, the top lips overlapped the bottom ones and created this super dark patch because of the ambient occlusion. So I carefully clean that up so that when the mouth is open you don't get like weird tooth marks in the bottom that are like super dark. I also go around now baking the other textures in, like the roughness and the metalness for the horns and the eyes and the claws. I also make sure the ambient occlusion is baked in for the tongue and for the teeth, because they also have like small details that need to be brought out with ambient occlusion. And yeah, I essentially spend the rest of the time just cleaning up stuff and making sure it all looks good on the textures. In the end, I want the model to just have 3 simple textures: the base color, the roughness, and the metalness. And you can just plug them into like whatever software you're using, or in this case just a regular old principled shader, and everything will come out looking right. And that's what I did, and that all worked out pretty well. Now you can see me making the major roughness map, as well as the metalness map for all the parts of the body. It's mostly just one flat color, since the whole like main part of the body and the hair and the mane and all that just has one, like the same roughness and metalness all over, which is no metalness and just like medium roughness, I guess. So really the only shapes that are particularly visible in there are like the teeth and the claws and the horns and stuff like that. So this model isn't gonna have rig, because I don't really offer that much rigging for my commissions for the most part. So in order to pose it for a fancy render, I decided to use mostly sculpt mode and a bit of edit mode. So I merged all the objects together into one, and then headed into sculpt mode and started using the pose brush to mess around with the pose. I also made a shape key to make sure I don't like make the pose the base model so I could like switch stuff around and tweak stuff in case there was something like I didn't quite like. I started by posing the head. For that I masked it out and used the rotate brush to move it into a pose I liked. I also added a little bit of smile using the snake hook tool and the grab brush. Then I dug out my old shape key to open the mouth and open the mouth a little bit to make it a wider smile. I also had to tweak the teeth because I had forgotten to apply the mirror modifier before I started posing. But it's all looking good, so I continue on to the pose of the body. For this I used the pose brush to carefully lift up one arm to make him wave. I again masked it out and carefully rotated it. You can move the origin of the rotate brush by setting the transform like center to the 3D cursor and then moving the 3D cursor to where you want to rotate around. And yeah, so I moved the arms around, posed the second arm further down, then I masked out the whole top of the body, and again used the rotate brush to twist it around a bit to give him a bit more of a dynamic pose. Next I move one leg back so that it's like not fully symmetrical. Now for the tail, I wanted that to wrap around the whole body, and I was hoping I could do that with a pose brush, but that wasn't really working super well. So instead I went into edit mode and just carefully selected parts, used the 3D cursor as like the origin for the transform, and then just carefully went around and posed it till the point where I was happy with it. And then again I went back to the legs, this time using the pose brush, and moved it back until I was also happy with how that was. Now with the pose done, I quickly add in a cylinder and like shape that into a kind of little pedestal or like base thing, so he isn't just floating around in the air. And finally I go back into sculpt mode and use the relax brush to move the elbow back into place. Like I had some specific topology for the elbow and it was kind of floating around somewhere near the shoulder, so I pushed it down so that it would be where it should be. And finally I put him back in the regular old lighting setup, add a bit of a material to the base, and he's done. And here he is. I'm really happy with how he turned out, and so is the commissioner, which is always really nice. I've learned quite a bit throughout this process, and there's a lot of stuff that I can improve while making future models, and I'm excited to try all that stuff out. If you want to see all that experimentation and join me on my future modeling processes, definitely stick around. For those of you who are on the Discord, you already know that I'm working on my next couple of commissions. As I said in the first video, I have quite a bit of a queue, so there are definitely more like short series like this coming your way in the future. Though I'll still try and squeeze in a couple of paintings here and there every once in a while. And with that, that's all for me for today. I hope you all really enjoyed this video and have a nice rest of your day. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe check out one of my other videos to the right. If you'd like to see more of my art or maybe get a commission from me, I've put links to all that in the description below. And I've also put a link to the Discord server. Anyway, I hope you have a nice day and see you all next time.